Welcome to our very first podcast, video podcast of Dozers to Drywall. And I'm your host, Ray Lemming. I am the Director of Construction here at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And we hope that as we go along and develop this podcast that we cover many different subjects that are of interest to people who are in our audience and may want to know about certain things, or we get certain people in here. Being at the Illinois Institute of Technology, our first several podcasts will probably be more of our own people and what they may be doing or where they may have been and things like that. But as we develop an audience, I hope that we get feedback and we're able to bring other people in and talk about other issues. Dozers to drywall refers to the fact that on a construction project, we break the ground with a D8 and a ripper to pull up the earth, and then we put in our foundations, and eventually, at the end of the project, we put the interiors in after all the utilities. And of course, the most important part of any construction project is when the owner pays for a great big beautiful party, preferably with a pig roast or something, and we have our ribbon cutting. So that kind of refers to that and in between, and there may be subjects we talk about. Some of the cutting edge subjects we're looking at in today's world is AI. What is it? How does it fit into what we're doing? It seems nobody seems to know that. But we also are going to look at other things of how do we do certain things and that. I personally got about 50 years construction experience and a whole lot of stories in that, but I will try to avoid telling those to you, hoping that we get information out of our guests. My first guest today is Dr. Robert Ryan. We just hired him on our staff here in the fall, and he has quite an extensive work history before he came here. So I thought we'd start out by talking to him about some of the places he's been and what he's done. And one of the fun things about at least being civil engineers is you usually work on projects that moves rivers and moves mountains and that. And I know, Bob, you started out, if I remember right, on a cable stay bridge, was it?
No, very early on a cable stay. My first project out of school was actually on the Chickahominy River in Virginia. Bounced around, spent some time, then went to a cable stay in Delaware, Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where I got to see and do a lot of great things. But yeah, it's a great time starting my career. Do you want me to talk more on
No, go ahead. Tell us what it was like being a young engineer out on big projects like that.
Yeah, so when I got out of school, I'm born and raised in Chicago, and after graduating my undergrad, I went out east. I went to the mid-Atlantic, southeast, really the Virginia and Delaware, the Delmarva area. I worked for a company called Skanska USA Civil, and during that time, I intentionally went out there so that I could look and just see new things on larger projects at a larger scale. At a very interesting time in the world as the world faced the global recession in 2008. So I was lucky to have a job, and I was lucky to actually be on some large projects with some great people where I learned a lot, and not only learning and listening to them, but a lot of learning by doing. And that's how I spent most of my 20s. And as a result, I ended up, moving around a lot onto, their larger scale projects. They're more complex projects. So I first began on a traditional design bid build project with unit pricing, which was very neat, very complex, especially right out of school. Feeling the existing bridge move, something that I was not used to. Setting, traditional girders and feeling those move. These massive structures of how they give and take, with loads and just even heat, with thermal expansion and contraction. So I spent that time. Then I was brought back into the office to learn about project controls and the claims process and help support that, and even the beginning of automation nearly 20 years ago to date myself, to start that process. But then I went out on a design build on this cable stay. Very neat, very complicated project that some things went very well and some things did not. So I got to learn what to do right and things to avoid later. From there, I moved to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, and went on, which is funny, nearly 4 years into my career, one of the coolest projects with the best set of people I've worked with. So I got to see leadership in action. I got to be elevated and really own portions of work, and actually mentor others. So it was a wide range of both work performed, learning and teaching all throughout the same time. I eventually came back home, back to Chicago, and the rest is history. I eventually, can talk more on that, but right out of school, those were the neat things. I got to put work in place, understand how work was built, and really see how high class, organizations perform.
So, how do you feel that experience helps you train our engineers today or our construction people, as opposed to, say, a PhD who's done pure research their career?
I would say that the change, it is night and day, right? To be able to come from experience, not research, while research has tons of merit, and progresses, our field, the actual hands-on practicality to say, to really prepare our students for industry, to say, this is what will be expected of you, and these are the skills that you need, I feel is probably my biggest strength, because really out of school, I understood how some things worked in some higher level topics that I wasn't necessarily responsible for, or really didn't touch until much later in my career, because they were advanced topics. So I was learning advanced topics, but really wasn't introduced to the basics, right, until a few classes that just touched the tip of the iceberg, and a few internships kind of help shape and push it along. But really, I always tell my students is those first 3 months out of school, that first year, the first few years out of school, that's really where I learned the most to really make myself where I'm at, to set me on the trajectory of where I'm at today. So my desire to share those lessons, and I always joke that some of them were really hard-earned lessons, meaning that I made mistakes. Mistakes were okay, and those tend to be the ones that I remember the most and try not to repeat. So I think that really sets the difference, and that's really the message that I try to send to my students in any class, right? Is that you got to get out there and you got to try things in order to learn them.
What about the trades and the superintendents? I had a superintendent at one point that he called anybody who was an engineer a college-educated idiot, and there's a lot of value in that education, obviously, of being in the real world, but there's this wealth of people that didn't get the education where they studied calculus or whatever.
Well, with that crusty old superintendent, there is some truth to that, right? And it depends on where you're at in your experience and how you approach the work. If, I've dealt with plenty of those superintendents throughout my career, and I generally overcome those hurdles by demonstrating that I want to learn, right? And applying those principles, right? I always say it's not always in the book, right? It's sometimes what you're seeing and understanding what's next. So, while that superintendent can sit there and, bang his hands on the desk and say, you college kids don't understand anything. It's also a responsibility to teach and learn, right? So you want to be able to learn and put yourself out there so that you can get yourself better.
And I'm kind of curious in that regard. You said 20 years ago. How different do you see this world that our students are going out into today compared to the one you went out into?
I think the trajectory is much faster, right? As I said earlier, I graduated right as the global recession hit. So the economy shrunk. Construction companies were, private, people who built private started going public and started flooding the sector, right? So you just saw a drastic undercut in things, right? So I entered the market in what you would call a buyer, a buyer's market, where the employer had the advantage and had the cream of the crop. As we're seeing the industry trend towards less people entering, right? And I think 2008 was really the start of that. And you're also seeing a lot of experienced people leave the market due to retirement. But then at the same time, you're seeing a demand, a higher increase, right? The Infrastructure Jobs Act, all these kinds of things that are pumping up demand. You're really seeing young professionals' trajectory go fast, really climb high really quickly. Like in my case, right, it would be, I spent 4 years before I got promoted, and I was doing a great job on some very high profile projects, and I was trusted to do some great things, and I executed at a very high level. But the fact of the matter was that there just wasn't room for me to go vertical at the time. And that's how it was even, 20 years before I started, 40 years ago, that there was only a certain amount of growth. And now you're seeing people at top and in the medium leave and go other directions. And so there's this really, really neat opportunity for people entering the industry to advance and to get a lot of experience very quickly, but even more responsibility in probably half the time it would have taken me, to be honest.
So overall, it sounds like you're very satisfied with what you do.
Yes.
And you worked on things other than bridges too, didn't you?
Yeah, so I'm about midpoint of my career, if I do it right. And the journey that I've had has been atypical, and it's been a very, very fun journey. I started, like I said, I started my career in out east and really in operations, right, putting work into place. As my career progressed, I started getting different responsibilities. With through different viewpoints, right? I then went into more of the project management of submittals and billing and account receivable and understanding. I always understood where budgets were on the production side, but really the planning and overall view of it. And then I started going on to the pursuit side, right? The estimating side of procuring more work, procuring different types of work, right? In different industries, different contract methods. Just really neat things, and businesses growing and trying to double their revenue in a few years and going through that, right? So that was a lot of fun. What eventually happened was I worked for a company, and they decided to close their doors on the civil operations, and that gave me a completely different, unique perspective to open myself up to other opportunities. And what ended up happening was, because before that I was a bridge and a highway person, and I was approached to help the United States Navy consult them on their shipyard infrastructure optimization program, which this is a really neat, fun, passion project of me. For me, it's currently slated at a 20-year program at $20 billion, but we got, the company that I was working for got involved in its very first dry dock. And what a dry dock is it is a three-sided structure adjacent to a body of water that you pull a vessel in, you close a door, which is called a caisson, and you pump the water out and you repair these ships in the dry. So we got involved with the first one that was, I should say the first one, the latest of the last one that was built was about 60 years ago. So the first one in about 60 years, we got involved in it. And I got to have a different lens where I helped the design team understand constructability and provide budgets that actually went to Senate for appropriations to inform them. And I've done that for about 6 years now, because that was right before my oldest daughter was born. And so throughout that time, I've dealt with different work inside for the Department of Defense as a civilian. My work has taken me from the private side of consulting and advising design teams to actually directly becoming I'm now a former federal employee, become a federal employee and helping the United States Navy understand, cost, schedule, and risk on this massive program that is occurring, on both coasts and on the Hawaiian Islands. So dealing with just these magnitudes of costs from going to, my career has taken me from, putting a $150 million design build project in place and doing all the coordination and planning and execution with it, to pursuing, a $1 million project to a $200 million project with different roles, different responsibilities, to then, advising the United States Navy on a $2 billion project, and then getting my hands involved in a $20 billion program, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg where my career has taken me, I joke, just about everywhere but Chicago, because I've spent plenty of time living and a good amount of time of working in Chicago, but I've also been able to travel throughout the U.S., not necessarily outside of the country, but travel outside of the continental U.S., to Hawaii and Alaska, and just seeing all of this work being put into place and different geographies of how those in fact impact projects, both from a physical standpoint but an economic standpoint. It's been very fun for me.
Yeah, in my career, I built or worked on a couple of locks, and I've always kind of thought as a dry dock as a lock that's missing the gates on the far end. But I guess it could be like that. One of the interesting things, though, about working on a project like you talked about, where nothing has been built in 50 years or something like that, is you go through the old archives and look at what they did and how they did it, and then you get to use your modern knowledge, whether it's computers or bigger pieces of equipment. Much of the work I did involved millions of cubic yards of concrete that were built on dams in the 1930s and that. And the way we did it in the 1990s was totally different. And so that's got to be kind of a neat part of working on a historic project like that.
It's so neat. And I give an example of another organization I worked from. But before I do that, right there, you got to understand what Professor Lemming is saying here is that, you have, 50, 60 years ago, right, there were not as strong as advancements in technology, right? So an example, maybe not 50 years ago, but like a steam shovel versus a hydraulic excavator, right? So there's all of these improvements, right? And we're facing that and encouraging it, right? Technological advances of how to do things quicker, more efficient, and safer, right? And that key word is safer, because there were definitely trade-offs in the old days where things were significantly more dangerous, right? There were not as many environmental concerns, just out of ignorance, right? You look at the case of the Golden Gate Bridge, of safety nets, how that innovated, right? Construction, of putting lives, into account of design, of temporary work, and how that has progressed, right? And so what you get to see with the old way versus the new way, the methods have changed. There's been definitely advances to make it quicker and faster, but then there's also been a conscientious way in the new way to stop, to make sure you're doing it safely, to make sure you're doing it environmentally right. So all of these other considerations that we just didn't think about, 60, 80, 100 years ago. So you have these different productions that you tend to see as like, it's actually kind of a wash, where we're doing things at about the same pace, but we're doing it significantly safer. We're doing it significantly environmentally friendly, right? We're not polluting it as nearly as much as we would on the same project 100 years ago. And I reference all of that because I work for a wonderful organization who collected all of the data on like they've been in business since post World War II, and they've collected data on their productions, how fast they've done work on this project and that project and that project, and they've archived it, and they tend to use that in their bid analysis of, you know, do we think where our work is similar or not, to the point of, you know, where they're at in their organization is that a project that they built in Florida in 1960, they actually demolished that bridge this year, right? So they built the new bridge, and they had a full understanding of you know, different stratas of rock and everything. They had everything cataloged, and they understood it. And the analysis that they performed was, you know, yes, there were less advances in technology. We can do things quicker, but we definitely weren't, you know, we didn't have things like OSHA to consider, or, you know, environmental regulation of marine mammal monitoring and fish windows, right? So they were able to actually look at the, you know, here's the same bridge we're building, you know, 60 feet over, and what does that all look like, and how does that work? So it's been a unique full circle of things, and it makes things even more exciting where the future will hold as we get more advances and we figure out how AI works, right? And how we can implement it, how we can make things faster, quicker, safer, right? Hopefully cheaper. And look back and say, yeah, you know, we built this back in the early 2000s, and, you know, things were way different, right? And hopefully we're safer. Hopefully we're more environmentally friendly, right? But hopefully we're quicker, right? Hopefully we're finally able to break that mambo of give and take of technological advances, and then, you know, other restrictions.
You know, you held a little bit of a chord there. Many years ago, one of the first Primavera schedules I ever did was the construction of the Duval County Jail in Jacksonville. And I just saw about 2 weeks ago, it's completely out of date and they're tearing it down. So I did the schedule before they ever built it, and we kind of went through that, and now it's being torn down. And you kind of got to envy some of the Romans that at least their Colosseum is still standing to some degree in that, you know.
Yes.
But that is, again, that's the nature of our business. And that is the excitement, is we get to see some progress. We get to build things. We see some a solution at the end. And I think that's quite an important part of construction management. The other thing that I kind of like in construction management is any 5 construction managers will do the project 5 different ways. And we all see different ways to get this done. And, you know, you want to talk about that variance a little bit?
It's a great example. I always give the example when you're planning and you're talking and you want input. There's time to learn and understand potential pitfalls. But the saying that I always say is, if you put 5 people in a room, 5 to your exact number, is if you put 5 people in a room, there's going to be 7 wrong answers, right? Everyone's going to have their way of doing it, of what they think is best. And so that's the uniqueness of construction, right? It's not always A plus B equals C, or you have to have these approaches. There's all sorts of things that you're managing as a construction manager, right? You're managing, you know, all sorts of resources, right? Whether that's material, whether that's equipment, right? Whether that's the actual schedule or budgets, right? But most importantly, you're managing people, right? And you're building unique things. No 2 projects are exactly the same. You may have some very similar cookie cutter type projects, but they are never the same. And the reason for that is not only site conditions, right, and areas, but it's the people. And to me, that's always been the funnest. Not always. That's been one of the most funnest things, because really to go back to what you were saying, right? You get to see the work in place, and that was always something that drove me to do more, to do better, because I could see it, right? And I could have that goal to say, you know what, I want this end vent built by the end of this week, and I could see forms going up, and I could see rebar going in, and I could see the concrete place, and just chasing that thrill of, yeah, you know, we set a goal and we accomplished it, right? that always wanted me having more. And that's really where I trace my success to it, of having those receptors fire and getting that dopamine of saying, hey, we did this, right? And let's do the next thing, and let's see what we can do more, and just challenging yourself and doing better. So to take it back to the people, it's all of those people that you're working with, right? And people being on different wavelengths and having different motivations, right? But hopefully, maintaining eyes on the prize, right? What the end goal is of delivering a project successfully, right? Safely. Hopefully on schedule or ahead of schedule, and on or above budget, right? Keeping quality, keeping environmental, right? Keep meeting all of those goals, right? And doing it in a forward manner. While that doesn't always happen, right? That's what you want, and that's what you aim for. And as you're working with people, it brings out the best in people, but it also can bring out a lot of stress in others. And the ability to recognize that and work with people and view them as humans is a wonderful thing that makes construction so great.
I think you hit a key point there, a point that I talk about frequently to my students, and I don't know if they quite grasp it, but that is that every construction project is a first-time job. There is no learning curve. It's not like building iPhones where the 1 millionth iPhone is going to be a better iPhone than the number 10 iPhone off the assembly line. And we do that by creating temporary organizations. We create an entire organization, a project organization, usually out of subcontracts, but sometimes if you happen to be like my years in the Army, you'd tell them, I need carpenters or plumbers from that unit over there, but you still create this temporary organization. They all come together. That organization changes over weeks or months as one group comes in, another group goes out, and that. But I think a key part of the whole thing is your weekly construction meetings, because a big part of your job is improvisation. You have to change what you're doing, what you thought you were going to do. Probably very, very few people remember the television show The A-Team, but in that TV show, every week, everything would go to hell in a handbasket. And then the main character would chomp at his cigar and he'd say, I love it when a plan comes together. And to me, that's kind of a construction manager, because you're sitting there and improvising. So talk about your weekly meetings and how you improvise in that.
Right. And so it is improvisation, right? The thing with the schedule is a very important planning tool. It is. I want to make sure that I'm very clear on that before I go a different route. Schedules are important. Understanding where you're at and where you're going and when you need to be there are so important, right? It provides you a roadmap to a project, right? But with that being said, it is a plan. It is not a crystal ball that you can forecast and precisely predict all of the time, right? That is the goal, but that doesn't always happen, right? So you always need to adjust and as field conditions happen, right? A schedule may account for rain, but it may not account for the specific day that it rains, right? And how that impacts the crew in terms of what work they can put in place and what they can't, right? So there's always an element of having to adjust, right? Whether it's materials not coming in on time, weather events, items outside of just other items outside of your control, right? It's the need to communicate that, right? Where you're at and what you're doing. And so weekly meetings, daily meetings, right? And depending if it's a mission critical project where it may be hourly meetings, right? I've been on railroad outages where you've had to they give you 24 hours and they shut a rail down and you have to fix it. And they want to know where you're at every hour, where you're physically at in the work versus what you had planned and where you're tracking, right? But the point is with meetings, it first depends on the organization and the type of project you're on. When I worked in Washington, D.C., I would spend roughly 20 hours planning in meetings, right? And that was dealing with the people under my responsibility of making sure that I knew what they needed and they knew what I needed from them, right? And those would occur on a daily basis. That wouldn't be all 20 hours of those weeks, right? It would also be design discipline meetings because it was the design build. So understanding how the maintenance of traffic requirements would shift based on an unforeseen condition, given the fast pace of a design build project, right? We're understanding the next scope of work, right? Okay, we completed the foundations, and you know what, the piling, and now the substructure package, it's pretty close to being done. Let's understand it, right? Or it's being drafted and they need constructability input. How do we want to do this? What permanent design considerations do we need to take it into effect so that we can build it, safely, quickly, and hopefully cheaply, but with quality in mind. So it's a variety of meetings, and the whole point is to communicate where things change and why they're changing, right? And what results you need, right? Because the key to a good project is no delays. You want to keep momentum going, right? And that's really what meetings serve as. They serve as a place to stop and pause and talk about where you're at and where you're going, right? And most importantly, where you're going, what you need to get there. And that's whether it's in production, whether that's in design, right? Whether that's in closeout, it's to keep the project momentum moving forward.
So, and it's kind of interesting because one of the reasons that we're doing this podcast is we here at the Illinois Institute of Technology, we have several degrees and actually a couple more we're working on right now. But in our civil engineering degree, you can take the construction engineering sequence within that and become qualified in this. But our big one is our master's degree in construction management, and that's 30 credit hours, and that, and so. And at the end of this, I'm going to have my technician here put the URL in if anybody's interested in applying more to IIT. But this is the skills we teach: the scheduling, the documents, the cost control issues, as well as the technical things that most people have learned as undergraduates. And our undergrads, of course, are in a civil sequence, but we look at that. How do you, Bob, how do you find dealing with design engineers?
Design engineers are an interesting breed, right? I always had.
I like that, an interesting breed.
Yes, right, and it depends on the discipline as well. So it was always something unique to me, and really, right. We haven't talked about this, Professor Lemming, but I'm a CM undergrad, so I started my career out as a construction manager, not as a civil engineer. I eventually took the steps to get my professional engineering license, and it's really to better understand the design process, right? So I started my career as a CM. I worked with plenty of people that were hired the same week as me. They were civil, they were engineers, they understood the technical aspect of it, right? But your first few years in construction, you're not really designing. You're not designing temporary false work. You're not doing any of that. You can understand the design, but you're really doing things. My first, while the landscape has changed, right? It was surveying, right? It was quantities, right? Understanding, work put in place and how that matches your budget, how that manages your schedule, right? Subcontractor and vendor coordination. These things that you need in order to communicate to get the right resources at the right place at the right time, right? So that's what I spent most of my time at. I was fortunate to then have a CM degree to go for my master's because my company had actually paid for most of it. And so this was while I was out east, away from most of my family or most of my friends and all of my family. So I pursued it. And to me, the master's in the CM was really what drew me really, excited me, where the light kind of popped on, where I got to see the theoretical, the textbook, right? Here's the importance of these documents. Here's where all of this is. And then I got to live it. And I got to kind of see where that transition was, right? From the concept in the textbooks to the practical and the actual work put in place. And, here's how big organizations, great organizations execute things. And being able to see that balance of, it's not necessarily all in the textbook, and the textbook helps you provide and helps you understand that, because organizations are different, right? Each organization may operate differently, right? But to see that yin and that yang, right? See that balance in it was amazing to me, and that's really where my career as a professional and my academic my thirst for greater knowledge really clicked, right? That was that intersection for me when I got my first master's, was to do that, right? And see how those things applied. And that eventually made me want to get a master's of engineering, right? So that I could better understand, design engineers, right? To take it all back to that same question, right? Because it was always that constant, hey, I don't understand this. This seems too conservative. Why is it this way, right? And that was in temporary work with people that I worked with. That was on design build, right? Trying to push a project forward and not understand why certain designers were resistant to change or resistant to practical input, right? Sometimes being veiled as it being a design concern, but not all the case, right? Not always, but always a good easy way to say, no, I'm not going to change it, even if it's better for the project, because of this and this criteria, right? And that, I don't want to sit here and be dismissive of that, because that is absolutely valid when it is true, right? So working with design engineers, they're great at what they do, right? But sometimes they because they sit and design, right? They lack that practical experience and being able to see the job and seeing how their decisions and their design can have either really positive impacts or very negative impacts, right? And so I got to see that, in a design build where the designer was a subcontractor, right? So got to see that and have that input, see it on a traditional design bid build, right? Where the designer, what they said was the gospel, right? It was the same thing with the design build at the end of it, right? Of, no, this is what we're doing and why, go forward, right? But with the design build, you had that ability to discuss and better understand, whereas a design bid build, you would not. But then I got to really see how what they say, the sausage is made. So I got to, work for a design consultant, right? And have those constructability topics of hey, these precast members are just too big, right? We can't lift them and hoist them into the proper place with traditional methods. How do we go about, circumventing that? Can we change the design, right? Can we lighten the sections? How do we do this, right? So be able to see that and have that input, and sometimes that resistance, right? Because of where they're at in their design timeline and really, the criteria that governs theirs, of rational reasons why they couldn't lighten it, right? And taking a similar project and taking those practicalities and saying, okay, we're going to change this early on, and the team's going to design around that, right? To have that information that sometimes designers just lack, right? Because of their specialty of drawing and designing a thing that has not been built, instead of actually having put the work in place and see similar situations, while never identical, because construction is never identical, right? But very similar.
And you hit on a number of things there, but I'd like to shift just a little bit along that line to one of the problems I see in educating engineers and construction managers is there's huge emphasis to get good grades and be the top of the class and to do things, and particularly for engineers, that someday when they get out of here, they can't make a mistake because it has such ramifications in that. So there's pressure on you to get things right. But in the real world, everything's done in groups. And you may be the only structural engineer on the team, but you have a design team that you're part of. As you said, how can we make this lighter? How can we do that? And I think one of the great strengths that we have in our program is we do a lot of things in teams, in groups, and to learn that. And I know right now you're teaching the surveying course, and I know you're working diligently on the capstone course for the spring. You hope to bring many things to that capstone course. But talk about training our engineers in this ability to be absolutely the best they can be in what they do, yet to be part of an organization that they all contribute. How do we do that?
Right. So it's what I tell my students. It's what I told my interns. It's what I told my new hires throughout the whole process is mistakes are okay. They are not singular. Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean you may be solely responsible for something, right? And if a mistake happens, it first means that you're trying something new, right? And so the lesson that I give to everyone is mistakes are okay. They're part of learning, right? They're okay. Don't be so afraid to make a mistake that you don't make a decision, right? And I always cover that with, don't learn from those mistakes, right? Don't make the same mistake twice, maybe make a similar one, but a different circumstance, right? So that's the message that I always give students, right? Is that I was never in my undergrad, I was never an A student, right? I always challenge myself to learn different ways. I don't know if I should be saying that on a podcast, but here I am, right? The point is, right, if you are solely trying to chase a grade, you are not going to learn. You're only going to learn how to get a good grade. You're not going to take those examples and put them into real life, right? And when you get into the real world, you're going to be so afraid to make a mistake that you end up not doing anything, which is the worst mistake you can make, especially as a young professional, right? Because most people understand that when they bring on a recent grad, that they need to learn, that while internships are great and they've advanced, right? Hopefully they've learned and have lessened those mistakes. They're still going to do something new and they're still going to make a mistake. Hopefully it's minor, right? But to sit and think of a catastrophic mistake and the potential for a recently graduated undergrad that they would be put into that position is very, very unlikely, right? It's typically a mentored type situation where someone who understands what they're doing is guiding you, right? And if not, you're working in a team. And that's something with Capstone that I hope to bring, right? That's something in courses that we're teaching this fall, that we really teach teamwork, right? Because once again, construction is a people business, right? I've worked with some brilliant minds that did not have people skills, right? And they suffered in their career just because of how they approached things, how they worked or didn't work with someone, right? So instead of working and having unique perspectives, right? That joke of putting 5 people in a room and having 6 wrong opinions, right? Those 6 quote unquote wrong opinions all lead you to a better way of doing it, right? And there's some good, there's some bad, but it helps refine that process. And that's really done with teamwork, right? You need to understand when to push people, when to follow, right? When to pull, how to do all of that. But it's part of being a team, right? Things are not built by one person, right? To go back to that crusty old superintendent, right? He or she, right? They may know how to put the work in place and the best way to do it, right? But they may not know the ramifications of their decisions on how that, by using too many resources and hogging equipment, right? What that may do to the project's bottom line, how that it may impact the company, the organization, right? how all of that works, right? That's what project managers are for, right? Superintendents may not understand how to efficiently or follow up with submittals, right? And to do that work that superintendents traditionally do not do, right? It takes a team. It takes people doing the best that they can, communicating where challenges are, where either anticipated or unanticipated roadblocks go, right? But communicating that, because everyone's got their role. And while it's always good to grow and understand those roles, the roles of others, you really need to make sure that you're executing on your role, because it's going to vary day by day. But it's going to also vary as you progress.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about the superintendent. I popped into my head. I was building an interstate highway down in Texas once, and I had a great superintendent, fantastic guy. But he didn't want to hire dump trucks because he had to pay for those separately. And I finally convinced him after a week or two, my bucket loader's costing me 4 times what any dump truck would cost. Hire enough dump trucks that we always have at least one waiting to get loaded.
Right.
Because that was faster and cheaper for us than worrying about the cost issues on the earth moving. And once we got through that, he saw that for sure. Well, we're pretty well running out of time here, but I want to come back to what we do here at Illinois Institute of Technology in our construction management program. And I mentioned we have a master's degree. We also have the research degrees, Masters of Science and PhDs. If you're really interested in that, you can look at that. And we do have the civil engineers that learn construction engineering in our system there. And right now, it's November of 2025. We are putting together a degree that we hope in the fall to have a bachelor's in construction management. And we're hoping that that's going to be a degree that people who are in the junior colleges in the area, we've got 7 junior colleges that have associates in that, and people who are in other areas where they've gotten turned on to construction management, maybe working for an architect or something else. As a matter of fact, one of our other professors was a Caterpillar bulldozer mechanic, and he went out on a job site, and the architect asked if he wanted to stay there and work in the job trailer, and it was warmer and not as greasy, and he took that. From that, he ended up getting his graduate degrees. So there's lots of people out there like that. So by next fall, we should have that other degree. And if you're interested in any of that, take a look at our catalog that we have now. We should have a new one out sometime after February, but it's there. Or if you want to apply, or if you have more questions, you can look at any of the links that our technician has added here to our dozers to drywall. And I guess at this point, when we do the editing, this is where they're going to add the trailer with the bulldozers driving by or whatever it is. So I think that concludes our very first video podcast. Bob?
Thank you. Just remember, it's an exciting time to be in construction. Construction is exciting. It's an even more exciting time, right? As you progress in your career, you want to be working with people, right? So I always poke fun of the superintendent. It's the same thing with the project engineer who doesn't want to learn, who doesn't want to grow, right? Or the project manager who is stagnant, who doesn't want to plan, right? You want to work together as a team, right? You want to understand your team's strengths and weaknesses. And that's what really makes construction so fun, right? You get to work with fascinating people on technically challenging things, and you get to see the goal right in front of you being built. So, Professor Lemming, thank you for having me on. This has been a great one.
Well, thank you for coming, Bob.